and I'm happy to introduce my project. Thanks. Okay. My project is called DISPLACED. So I want to start with my story, or not my story, but 2 years ago I met Queen through a voluntary organization. So I met her there because, sorry, this is not, okay. So 2 years ago I met Queen through a voluntary organization. It's an organization that matches people from, like local people from Berlin with displaced people, so refugees that arrive in Germany and are arriving there. Queen is from Syria, and due to the war in 2015, she was forced to flee her home. And then she moved to Germany, and that's where I got to know her. If we think of the fleeing part on a timeline, we have that one moment in those people's lives where they're forced to flee. And then we have that part, the geographical movement of people like going to different places and then hopefully arriving in a host country. So this is a part that is, from a European-centered view, covered in media a lot. So we see those kind of pictures a lot, how they move, for example, also with boats and travel. But what we don't really see that much is that part when refugees then arrive in the host country. So what happens then? One sentence really got stuck into my head when I got to know Queen. So she told me that I could probably go through the entire journey of fleeing again somehow, but then the moment of arriving in the country and actually being a refugee, that's when she changed completely. And that's what made her change the most. So what actually happens when refugees arrive? Just a disclaimer in the beginning, I'm talking about displaced people as refugees, no matter what their modus of fleeing are and what their legal status is. I also consider or focus in my project on people that flee from non-EU countries to the EU. And the journey and the case study you will see from now on is based on data from Germany since 2015 up till now. Since I'm also not a refugee or have experienced that kind of journey, my research was mostly also focused on getting to know people and building those relationships to get valuable insights from those people, understanding the circumstances that they have been going through. So my starting point of the research was understanding that, of course, the part of fleeing is, the fleeing journey is defined by losses. So what the refugees lose is their homeland, their social networks, but also their habits, chattels, and so much more. But what is really crucial to understand and important to know is that they lose their social and legal status. And that's why I wanted to focus on the label refugee, so what this word means. When we think of labels, so what does a label mean? What is a labeling theory about? So labeling focuses on the way in which the agents of social control attach the stigmatizing stereotypes to a particular group, but also how those stigmatized groups then change their behavior since, once they are labeled. So my focus around the refugee label is then about the heist of agency, but also the heist of identity, once people are labeled with that. So those refugee labels, or the refugee label itself, labels do not exist in a vacuum. So they are tangible constructs of bureaucracy, but also social constructs. So first of all, it's very important to say that the government and legal structures define who is legally a refugee and who gets that kind of label. So they define in a legal structure what a refugee is and what kind of rights they get. But also media is talking about refugees in a specific way, creating a figure around this label and creating a figure around those people. But since we also heard in the labeling theory, it's not only about that, but also once labeled, how that changes the individual. So I also wanted to focus what that means for individual people being labeled the refugee. So since I have those three main categories, I divided the space of the gallery in those three chapters, talking about the legal, the media, and the individual parts. So the journey of arriving within my exhibition and arriving in the host country as well is then going through those, or like looking at the refugee label within those three different perspectives, talking about the status, the image, and the identity. I understood the label refugee as a transition state of identity, but also a curtailment of rights of those people. So that's why I wanted to work with blurred effects and materials that represent this transition state, and understanding that it's not a clear thing and it's a transition state. So I also used this concept to then communicate about my exhibition and draw a connection, or like draw attention to the label and also to humanitarian labels. In the beginning, I was doing an Instagram questionnaire asking what people associate with humanitarian labels, if they have been labeled themselves before, but also if they have suffered. In the end, I asked what they think is the most powerful humanitarian label. And this is how I redirected then to the account of the exhibition, revealing a letter and a visual hint every day, to then, after 1 week, stating that I'm talking about the refugee label. So in the beginning of my exhibition, I wanted people to be labeled from the beginning. So I created those kind of bracelets that were also talking about what status they will get. And since the receiving and actually getting the label is not as easy as it seems, I also had like 27 of the white bracelets, which initiates that those people are getting the refugee label, and all the other people coming to my exhibition will only be allowed for a certain time, or will have a limited stay. So talking about starting with a journey, people have to, like refugees arriving in a country, they need to apply for asylum. So the right to seek asylum is embedded in international law, but then the right to actually receive the refugee status, that's embedded in, it's a prerogative of the state. So Germany, for example, in this case, defines the legal structures of who becomes a refugee. What I wanted to make very clear in the beginning, everyone who applies for asylum will not get that title. Only 27% of all the people applying for asylum will get the refugee status, which is then granting them rights for 3 years and also a movement throughout the country. All the other people are either rejected or are in a transition state of their rights. But not only do they apply for those labels, they also, the state also, the state then defines how they treat them in specific ways. For example, during the application process, refugees live in specific kind of shelters. Those are like pictures of how those shelters, for example, look like. Living in those shelters, what is really depriving, talking to those people is, to the refugees I met throughout my project, is the limiting space one can get when they live in those places. So I created a floor plan, first of all, saying that these are the borders in which you're being put by the state, and you cannot move from there, but also how limiting this space then is. So for example, if we take a look at this one shelter here, which is like an area chart, this chart then says in that kind of shelter, people will only get 3.5 square meters as their personal space. To make people understand what 3.5 square meters are, I created also this frame in the exhibition to really get this feeling of, okay, this is the only space you will have for a minimum of 3 months living in those places. But what is really important to say is during the process of the asylum application, people live in those kind of shelters that you see on the left. But once they are recognized as official refugees within the country, then they're only allowed to move on to further homes. And these are then homes that give them more agency, as they're allowed to cook for themselves. Just as like simple things as that, or have more space, to understand like space is such a big importance when it comes to building your identity, or being a person that is being treated with a voice. The next chapter is then about the image that is being created about the refugee figure. So if we imagine that refugees go through this entire journey of becoming a legally recognized refugee and finally having rights that they have been granted now, they then face the next chapter of their journey while arriving in the country, which is then about understanding what society understanding what society is talking about you, or how they perceive you. I was using, so the refugee figure is created specifically through images within news, through media. But they do not only show, they show pictures of refugees in a very specific way. Also, so I wanted to show how much do we see of all those pictures with refugees. So what we see a lot is people in poverty. So 58% of the pictures that we see are in poverty. We also see 25% people being shown as victims. What we rarely see is people like refugees being thankful, although the people I've been talking to are so grateful to be able to live in the country and to be there. But due to media representing a very narrowed way, a specific kind of picture is then created in our heads as well. So what we think being in society, what we think refugees are like. But this refugee figure is not only created through pictures, it is also created through words. Because also words have the power to create a reality in which we perceive people. So I was using a content analysis study that was commissioned by the UNHCR that was analyzing the press coverage of refugee and migrant crisis for 5 years. And this is now the case study on Germany. I picked 2 very big newspapers. On the left you have the South German newspaper, which is rather a liberal and centered left newspaper. And on the right side you have a tabloid kind of style newspaper. So from the audience, they talk or address people completely differently, but when we go into the detail, they talk about refugees in a similar way. What I thought was very interesting when I was going into the data and understanding how they are described with words, it was really interesting to see that refugees are either described as harming or as helper. So they're only talking about those 2 different categories. So helper means it's a person in need of protection, but also taking away their agency. So all the way, like the way we are describing refugees, it's taking away their agency. And on the harming side, it's then being described as refugees threatening the culture that they are now going to be in. So what I was using is, first of all, the proportions of how they are described. But since I'm talking about words, I wanted to actually show those words and how they are described. So I used the text. Here you can see, for example, in those 2 different categories, how refugees are in those 2 different categories. Closer? Okay. But what about success? At the example of the Bild newspaper, since those 5 years, they have never ever reported on refugees being a successful story. And I think that's a very striking point. So in the exhibition, this was then structured in that way. So we had on the left side, we had the helper category, and the right, the harming. And in the middle, I was talking about how they were presented on success. In those columns, we had the South German newspaper and Bild, so always, having those two newspapers directly connected or able to compare. And then on those column sides, we had similar, same categories talking about refugees in those two opposing categories. For example, if aid is a solution, or rather seen that rejection is going to be the solution to the migration problem. So for now, we have seen how the government and legal structures are defining this label and those people. We also see. We have also seen how media is then talking about people, describing a specific kind of group. But I think now is the most important point to ask people, those people who have been fleeing, what it was like to live with this label. Because before they were forced to flee, they have been people like you and I. They had everything and had their lives planned and structured, but that moment of their lives then changed due to, for example, war. So in the last piece, I am talking about the identity that is being displaced. So I interviewed 3 refugees, and people in the exhibition could then listen to their stories. I did interviews that were almost 2 hours long, and then I cropped one to things that they were actually comfortable sharing, because I really wanted to make them also part of it and decide and not take away their agency on that final piece in the end. But since the refugee label has been part of those people's life for a different time, I also added pictures with a very blurred effect, but also a timeline showing or making people understand for what kind of period the refugee label has been part of their lives. I interviewed 3 people that had completely different experiences, so I think that made me create a more diverse perspective or look at the topic or the label refugee. So for example, he only got the refugee status for 2 years, and has since then been a stateless person. I also interviewed another girl who has been granted the refugee status in Germany and is now reflecting about the refugee label completely different, as she has been in the country for 6 years already and is still dealing with those processes. And the other one was a guy who has lived in the Ukraine and has just recently have been dealing with what it means to become a refugee in a new country. So what I was super thankful in this project is working with data, but to understand people and really understanding and working with them, going into multiple, really building relationships with them to understand what this journey is about. And I think I've never learned so much from those people as well. So I'm super thankful for that opportunity. But I'm also super thankful for your time, and I'm happy to hear feedback.